Has HR lost its soul? A big question. More and more employees who have an issue at work are turning to their colleagues, their managers, or the internet for help rather than HR. Has HR become the corporate voice of organizations, prioritizing compliance over employees? There aren't many people brave enough to take on this question in a podcast episode, but step forward Christoph Williams, Head of Talent and Leadership Development at Sony Europe. Christoph, welcome to In Good Company. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm really excited to kind of get into the topic of today's conversation. But before we do that, I'm going to invite you to answer the question that we ask all of our guests on this podcast, which is to tell us about yourself in 60 seconds.
Well, thank you very much for letting me join you on your podcast, first of all. I'm Christoph Williams, chartered occupational psychologist, long career in industry now, around 30 odd years, probably counting more. Spent time in academia, industry and consulting, so I've seen it all. I try to look at the latest research findings and apply those in my role to create innovative learning experiences. So that's what I attempt to do, and that's how I try to provide competitive advantage by adding value to my employers. I'm a father of 3 plus 2, complicated scenarios there, but I'm currently head of talent and leadership development at Sony.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate it. And the other thing you didn't mention is that you've only just moved house as well. So thank you. We really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Managed to damage the process.
Already got a work-related injury with moving house. Well, thank you. So let's move into that first big question, really. So has HR lost its soul? I guess we've kind of opened with that, and I would like to explore a bit more about why it is that we're talking about this today. What does that question mean to you?
Well, it's a thought-provoking question, first of all, and I'm not sure I obviously really understand it myself, which in a way makes it a good question. So, has HR lost its soul? Should HR have a soul? What is a soul? It immediately opens up all these other bigger questions. But what I've noticed when I ask this question to people, they get it. And I don't know if that's because they're interpreting the question differently, each of them, but it lights up their eyes and it opens up the doorway to a further conversation around where HR is at the moment, where we're heading, what direction we're going. And, I've been reflecting over the last 30 odd years of my career in terms of trends that I've seen. And when I speak to people, there's this sense of maybe HR isn't heading in the right direction. Maybe we should just stop and reflect and think about the direction that we're going in and whether we're really adding organizational value. So I see it as a conversation starting point, which then unravels a whole lot of other variables and considerations and things that we've seen over a period of time. Now, for some people, it might be, has HR lost its way in its sense of purpose? Maybe when we transferred from, I don't know if you remember, personnel management to human resources management, and where there's a sort of commoditization or depersonalization of the employee in the organization. And there's been lots of initiatives, trends which are taking place. For example, moving to the centre of expertise model, sort of business process re-engineering. And, there's a view that upon occasion that might result in our internal customers falling between the centres of excellence. So are we genuinely providing that customer experience journey across the board? There's been a trend to empower line managers by giving them lots of tools to support them in their roles, which of course is appropriate. But have we put rather a lot on the shoulders of our line managers? Do they really have the time when there are less line managers per head as well to perform some of those duties? We've given a lot of self-service using technology around portals so employees can access information, again, which is great as a principle. But again, are we expecting those individuals and the line managers to take up the responsibilities and fulfill some of the obligations that previously perhaps we might have supported more effectively? And some people have been suggesting, are we hiding almost behind this portal interface? So, our customers now raise cases on an internet portal. They don't necessarily have to speak to anyone. That case goes off into the ether and then they get a response at some point. And again, it's a mode of operating, but is that to some extent depersonalizing the experience, and are we seeing our customers as numbers rather than as individuals? So I think that's just a starting point to give you a flavour. I could go on, but I just want to give you the opportunity to reflect and maybe ask me something around that or something different. But broadly speaking, it's around the purpose, the value add, the customer service that HR as a function is providing for employees and the organisation, because of course we have responsibilities for both.
Well, and that was, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, and possibly not got time for it all, sadly. But the one thing you kind of mentioned there was that is it a bigger thing? Is it a bigger thing? Does it extend out to the kind of the wider business, where we're kind of, it might be now, and particularly with the advancements of things like technology and AI, which we'll kind of talk about a little bit more about later. The kind of human element of businesses is changing, I would say. So do you think there's been a loss of focus on the customer? And you kind of brought it up a little bit there. Do you think what would be, in your view, the ideal way to kind of help us get back and find our way again in HR? As you mentioned that you think HR lost its way. How do you think we can find our way back?
Well, that's a great question. Let me just start, I think, by stepping back and seeing if we can see a link between the customer service that an organisation provides to its external customers and see what drives that. Because I'm a great believer that external customer service is never better or more superior than internal customer service. Now, we did a piece of work once where we looked at what I called the customer service levels between two divisions within the organisation. So we looked at marketing and sales and the external customer. We're measuring external customer service levels using Net Promoter Score, which I'm sure people are familiar with, just a way of getting feedback from customers in terms of satisfaction of their customer service. Then we looked at the relationship by product level and category within the company between our two departments. And we did that by asking each individual in the marketing department who is supporting sales to identify the customers of each of their objectives in the performance management process. And to keep it simple, then the customers, which were the sales personnel of the marketing people, would indicate the level of customer service they'd got from whilst that person was working towards that objective. And basically, and they gave feedback and other stuff, but basically it gave us an internal index of the service levels that our marketing personnel were providing for the sales personnel. And what we found was there was a correlation between that internal customer service level and the external customer service level. Now, if I take that a step further back, there's another concept which we've been playing with, the line managers index, where individuals will, if you like, give a service level rating in terms of their satisfaction with their line manager. And we haven't looked at this yet, but my suspicion would be that line manager index, if you like, is probably correlated to the internal customer service level. In other words, if your manager is performing well for you, you are performing better levels of service yourself for your customers.
Yeah.
So then if we go back another step and say, right, what is driving the customer service levels, for a better expression, of our managers? What is the role of HR in that? And my sense is actually HR has a big role in that. I think we've got a lot to do with that. So if we can make sure that our managers are motivated, engaged, and performing effectively, then I think that impacts throughout the organisation and then delivers on the external customer service. So I certainly see a role for HR to ensure an organisation's customer service levels are maintained and enhanced or whatever. That's not to say that it's all up to HR, because of course it's not. The senior leaders in an organisation need to prioritise customer service and see that as a priority. And I think we've all seen across lots of sectors automated process improvements which are driving operational efficiencies in the business and supposedly maintain the customer service. And I'm sure there's lots of measures, well, I know there's lots of measures that organizations use to say, their service levels are improving and what a great job they're doing. But I would question that the experience of the end customer has improved in that time. Personally, my personal experience, having moved recently and having to change all my, bills and all the rest of it, it hasn't always been an easy experience. So, I do see, in relation to your question, a general theme across business that perhaps customer service levels have been negatively impacted upon by driving those operational efficiencies on a cost basis, because then it comes down to, well, is it down to the customer to select provider A versus provider B because they're cheaper, but perhaps they're not providing the right level of customer service or the same level of customer service. So I
So
think
have you implemented in anything within Sony then that's made some changes recently, or that you can talk about? What steps have Sony Europe made to kind of focus more on the internal customer to have that knock-on effect to the external customer?
Not something that we've done recently, but in the past, that initiative I just described to you, that was something that we did, which proved that there was a link between internal and external. I'd like to say that we've built upon that and made that more broadly, but the honest answer is no. Moved on to different priorities at the time, and maybe that's a sign for me as well. So right now, I'm sure there's lots of initiatives on customer service that Sony as an organisation is driving. We definitely have. If I think about the sorts of things that we do internally, we will get feedback from our internal customers around their perception towards us and the levels of service that we are providing with, various comments, etc. So that's used as a bit of a pulse and monitor, I suppose, that we can constantly use to see how we're performing. And that's great. And we also have other dashboards and data, as do other companies. And this is another theme that I see, the collation of data to create a dashboard. And I'm sure AI is going to impact upon that. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, because we do need these harder measures. But at the same time, I feel there is sometimes a tendency for us to almost create our own reality from this data set, and it gives a sense of comfort. This is how we're performing. Look how many cases have been given, how many cases have been closed. Aren't we doing well? Give everyone a pat on the back, and justify to the business our performance. And don't get me wrong, we do need to measure performance, but I sometimes question whether, if you were to go out and ask the employees face to face for over a cup of tea around their perceptions towards the division and their performance, I'm not sure that the response that we'd get would necessarily align with the data in those KPIs. That's my key point.
Interesting, yeah. We talked briefly, and I'm going to try and move back into the kind of customer centricity point that you brought up, and it's obviously core at Sony Europe. And I suppose it's what would you say is the way to find the balance between focusing on customer centricity, but also like kind of employees, teams, the organization generally, profit, planet, wider communities, all of those things? What is there anything in particular that you think is like the golden answer to balance that responsibility for all of those elements?
Yeah, that's a big one, isn't it? It's, I guess, the challenge, isn't it, of I don't know if it's a balance or a consideration of all of those factors, because how can I put it? Efforts to drive corporate social responsibility, ethical consumerism, design delivering products without damaging the environment, for example, all of those are positive aspirations for a good company. And we need to be able to fulfill our business operations whilst keeping to the highest standards. And Sony does a great job in that regard from my perspective. And I would like to think that is reflected in the the behaviours of our customers. So if our customers know that we are an ethical business and that we are sourcing products in an ethical way and that we are treating our employees, with dignity, respect, etc., one would like to think that that's reflected in the brand name, the brand image, and as a consumer, we are more responsible in our purchasing behaviour around prioritizing one brand over another. So, conceptually, I can see that there is a way of maintaining those aspirations to minimise negative impacts on the environment, etc., and society. In reality, when that consumer's standing there in the store and choosing between one brand and another, how much does that impact on their consumer decision making? I think the jury's out. I'd like to think it does have an impact, but clearly there's a pressure on business always to drive down costs, and there's going to be a tension at times, I suppose, as to how you can do that and maintain your profitability whilst at the same time upholding those high standards of ethics.
It's interesting you say that about whether your customers in the shop looking at two different brands and whether they consider their kind of their impact on like the environment, say. But I think also we're not just seeing it there; we're seeing it people when they're looking for work now. We find ourselves. So a lot of people who look at organisations that they want to work for are actually making those considerations, and I think that will then have a knock-on effect as to the output of what that organisation is doing. So I guess that's where that becomes more. And that then has that knock-on effect, doesn't it? Because if those people are passionate about paying particular attention to those elements, whether it's planet and wider communities and those kind of things, then that's going to have a knock-on effect to the customer as well, regardless, and because they'll make it work. So yeah, that's kind of something that we've seen a lot of recently. Is the way that people are changing to those organisations. Let's quick. Sorry,
let me play around with this, because
please do, yeah.
You're absolutely, there is this view, maybe the different generations coming through have a different value set and different perceptions and motivations and the like, and there probably are differences. I know the jury's out there a little bit, but at the same time, 30 years ago, I think people were concerned about the environment. Actually, I think young people were still concerned about the environment then. So maybe there's some shifts, but actually I think sometimes they're maybe elaborated and exaggerated a little bit, because actually I think human motivations and values have been pretty consistent over time. Yes, they may increase or reduce in terms of priority, but I do think actually a lot of consumers and employees were generally concerned about the environment 30 years ago. And I'd also challenge whether, once an individual has joined an organisation, how positively as an individual they can change the organisation to perform in a more ethical manner. Yeah, so it's a nice thought to think, yes, we've got a whole bunch of employees join the organisation who are very value driven and have the right priorities, so to speak. But that doesn't necessarily mean that will always then impact on how the business is operating. It's a nice thought, and when I think about some of the initiatives that we have internally, some great initiatives, we do ask employees to get involved almost on a sort of voluntary basis. So I can see that there's some sort of opportunity there, but I at the same time, I don't think we should overplay it. And I also think, sorry.
No, do you think that's sort of culture based in terms of whether there are those opportunities? Do you think that where do you think it should come from, those kind of responsibilities? Do you think it should come from the top or work its way from the bottom, or a combination of the two? What do you think?
I think I'd probably go for the combo of the two, which is the easiest answer, I suppose. I think, I do generally think with most things, the senior leadership on board driving it then provides opportunities for people to be empowered, and they also have a responsibility, I think, to push upwards. And I think that's true for many things in an organisation when it comes to change. I think you need both of those. Otherwise, you kind of get people from the bottom up trying to agitate and create that change, and they're getting suppressed or whatever, and it doesn't work out so well. So I do think actually the combo approach of senior leadership providing the direction, giving the opportunity and the autonomy for people then to fill those opportunities, if you like, to make stuff happen. So definitely I think you need both of those.
Yeah. I mean, we could talk about that for a long time. I'm sure it's an interesting bit. I probably want to focus or refocus back into the kind of HR, and we're talking about soul. And one thing that we kind of, when we were prepping for our conversation today, we thought, well, we can't, have you in from a technology company such as Sony Europe and talk about HR, and then of course talk about the elephant in the room at the moment, which seems to be artificial intelligence. I kind of wanted to get your input really on that, and how you're seeing maybe the impact of AI within Sony, and how it's been working for you. Have you seen kind of any AI anxiety at all, and anything like that? Because that is kind of a thing that's trending at the moment. And what do you see as overall? What do you kind of see as the effect, or what role does AI take, or what role does it play? Does AI play in the changing landscape of HR?
Okay, so there's a lot for me to cover there in a short bit of time. So let me do my best. Okay, so my personal take is there's obviously a lot of hype about AI. I think to some extent probably appropriate, because I do think longer term it will probably have a fairly significant impact, although I think that's still quite difficult to determine exactly what that will be.
Sure.
Short term, I do think there will be roles in administration and sort of, forecasting, those sorts of, types of activities where I think AI will probably have a more immediate impact. I think when I've used AI myself and tried it out, I found that it provides a good sort of good but not excellent starting point. So I see AI at the moment, at least, as being something that we can use to enhance performance, but I don't see it at the moment as being something which is being exceptional. So when I'm trying to design the learning, and I literally put in, please design a training program, blah blah blah. Yeah, now I got a great answer back, but it wasn't innovative. It wasn't leading edge, which, if you think about how AI works, is perhaps not surprising, because it's crawling around, getting all the information from wherever, and then spurting it back at you. So it's only going to know what it knows. Yeah. So if you're on the cusp, if you're trying to do things differently and better than anyone else, and you are genuinely innovating in your field, AI is not going to impact upon that. I don't think. So I think I think there are other technologies, ironically, where combined with AI may have a significant impact, particularly around the HR field. So the use of, or the development of, technology for scanning people's brains, sort of EEG and other technologies, electrocardiograms. There's some great tech now out there, and that's people can purchase. And I could see that being connected to AI to help us understand human behavior more effectively, and how people interact, and the synchronization that happens between people's brains, etc. So using that to understand people's cognitive functioning, emotional functioning, that could enhance our understanding of how human beings behave. So I see that's a really interesting area of research where I think AI could potentially support. And I think innovation tends to happen on the boundary between where we can utilize technology to suddenly do things which previously we couldn't do. Yeah. So, for example, in the human brain and understanding how that operates, previously we haven't been able to do it as effectively as I believe we now can. We can do hyperscanning, so we can do it with a great variety of individuals simultaneously. So I see that as an inciting area. And when it comes to AI, people are, saying, is it sentient? It can't experience emotions, etc. And at the moment, it certainly can't. But I would question, well, does it have to? If it can understand the emotions of human beings, and I think using some of the tech I was mentioning before, there are probably things that can be learnt by AI about ourselves, if you like. And maybe it could even then provide us with support on how to best manage our cognitive and physiological resources, not just through bio-neurofeedback, but also the awareness of other people who might be near us, and how we might choose to respond in a specific situation. We can almost have context-sensitive, immediate information, or hints and tips, for want of a better expression, from our AI helper. So, I see AI as actually quite an exciting prospect, and I see it's enhancing human capability rather than replacing it. when I look at HR more broadly, I've seen AI tools for creating job descriptions so that they appeal more to specific audiences. I've seen AI being used for, I think it's automatic lie detection. I've seen
Automatic what? Sorry.
lie detection. So I think it's, you video someone's face and you look at the facial features, etc., and the synchronization with the speech. I'm not quite sure how it works, to be honest, but I think it's being
Sure.
used, when your candidates may not be telling you 100% of the truth.
That's interesting. That.
Yeah, it is.
Where have you seen that used? Or
Um,
maybe you shouldn't say.
not within Sony. Let me assure you that.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
go on the internet. I'm sure there's something out there on it.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah.
So yeah, and but personally, in my field, learning development, we've been looking at using VR for simulations of different types, and again, seeing if we can link it to the cognitive physiology or even speech patterns between people in different situations. And I know other people have been using VR to support people who may have had mental health issues or struggling with communication skills. So that,
Yeah.
obviously provides a safe environment, which can be relatively realistic as well. So I see that as exciting bits. The one thing that concerns me a little bit is what I call the crud factory, which is basically if we're creating all this good material but not brilliant, are we in danger of flooding the marketplace or the internet with all this crud, for a better expression, and it just takes up all the processing powers of all those massive computers around the world in a very environmentally unfriendly way, and
Sure.
actually it fills our heads with the okay stuff that makes it harder for us to find the really good stuff. So, one slight concern I've got in my mind is, are we in danger of creating a lot of content with the value of which is okay stroke good but not exceptional, and does that then create other issues for us?
I mean, I suppose it's fair to say that's already a problem, but not necessarily done by AI. Yeah, I mean, I was fascinated by the prospect of using sort of artificial lie detection in interviews, and I'm going to certainly be doing a bit more research into that after this conversation. Because that I mean, there's a big question around ethics with that as well, isn't there? Because I mean, it's because there's so much there with, well, if that technology didn't exist, that would be totally up to the human to make that call as to whether they think that they're telling lies or not. So to use that in an employment point of view, that's really, really interesting. And kind of the ethics, and would you? I mean, maybe if it was working for the government, then yeah, I that's probably a lot for that. But I other organisations possibly. I don't know. I don't know. It's a really fascinating one.
Let me just jump on that one again, because I think you're right. And also, if, for example, we learn about a potential employee or an existing employee's physiology and cognition, and we pick up that actually maybe some people are more resilient or able to deal with pressure than others, or maybe someone has susceptibility towards pressure, then how, as a dutiful employer, do we respond to that?
Yeah.
Do we end up, if we got a more senior role, which we know requires people to be, deal with pressure and resilient, is it ethically right to then seek potential prospective employees, internally or externally, with a particular, physiological, psychological makeup, because we believe that they will be better at doing that? And for those that we think might struggle, how can we best support them to make sure that they're going to be okay? So I think there's a whole load of ethical issues which are just around the corner, which are going to be very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's it, and I think that I think that's where the human element will come into it all, isn't it? Is that decision around ethics? Yeah, it's fascinating, but unfortunately, I must move on.
Okay.
So, with focusing back on the human element, what your role is head of talent and leadership development at Sony Europe. So, let's kind of go for some practical advice that people that are listening or watching today can take away. So what advice, what steps would you give or recommend HR professionals to take to influence and create a culture of leadership within their organization, and how to ensure that their talent within that surround them feel valued and prioritized at all levels of the company.
So again, another big question. So I'd say that the obviously having a clear corporate purpose, mission, vision, however you want to describe it, is important, so that people have a sense of direction and to some extent belonging. But I think that can be enhanced by allowing leaders to create their own purpose, vision, and mission for their teams, clearly aligned with the corporate one, but having a degree of autonomy, and I would say almost responsibility actually, for leaders to have the opportunity to do that with their team is really important, because I think that gives them a clear sense of individual and group purpose and a sense of belonging within that group, because we're social creatures, and I think that's important for our psychological well-being. So one of the things I think is really important is to actually recognize the importance and empower and encourage managers and leaders, line leaders I like to call them, to participate in that activity themselves, rather than just accept the corporate version. I think actually it needs to be contextualized. I think there's lots of things. I think having a leadership development program, or opportunities where how can I put it, employees have the opportunity to do projects which could be, for example, around some of the ethical things we were talking about earlier, and the opportunity to demonstrate their potential outside of their immediate job role, and have that recognized within the organization, is a really positive way to engage the workforce, the talent, and the leaders in a process which is empowering individuals to, almost back to what we were talking about earlier, to be able to fill those spaces which the leadership team has said are available to fill. When I don't mean spaces as positions, I mean spaces and doing good stuff, adding value to the organization. So I think the alignment of managers creating their own, if you like, subcultures in the organization, all aligned with the same purpose, mission, and vision, having a talent initiative with what I call a permeable membrane. And by that I mean that it's not about saying you're talent, you're not talent. It's about saying we're all talent. At the moment, this person might have talents which are more important and critical to our organization, but if you show your potential, it may well be that you can be in that talent group and on that talent program. So everyone can aspire to being on these types of leadership programs, as opposed to it's left for the elite. Because I think there's a real danger in talent management. We focus on the top, 6, 10, whatever it is, percent. Yeah. And then what about everyone else? You kind of like disengaged most majority of your workforce, and they're really important too. So, I think having something which touches a wide range of people, and one of the things we're looking at, and we've got some way to go, I think still, but is creating links between different populations in the organisation, so that, for example, you get an ideas flow from our interns to our graduates to our emerging leaders to our senior leaders, and mixing that talent group up, I think has a really positive momentum and impact on the organisation and the culture, and other people see that, they witness it, visibility of that, because and to a certain extent we can design that in the engagement of and visibility by senior leaders to recognise these things as well. So as a starting point, I would say line managers having the autonomy to align to the corporate messages, but to do that in a contextualized way, to have some sort of system or processes, and I don't want to call it too formal either, whereby you're connecting the different talent populations that you've got and the golden nuggets that they can come up with. Because at the end of the day, more often than not, the operational efficiency and the potential new revenue streams are emerging from, somewhere at the lower echelons in the organisation. It's not always, the senior leaders who will know exactly what the opportunities are. Yes, they set the direction, but they need to be supported in a way. And again, it goes back to what you said earlier, actually, the combo approach, as we were calling it. That is that top down and the bottom up, either agitation or ideas coming through. And I'm a great believer that you need both of those. So, to make all of that happen, of course, you need senior leadership endorsement and
Of course.
their support, visible support as well.
And so I want to really narrow that down so that there's, because I really like what you said there about, that enabling that or allowing that a space for talent not only to be the elite but also the perhaps giving people the opportunity. So what if, say there's a line manager that's listening to this, what would you say directly to them that they could do as soon as they finish this, like one kind of golden nugget, as you put it, that they could go away and go, right, I'll implement that tomorrow?
I would probably start with the clarifying the purpose, vision, and mission for your team, and working with your team to do that. And as a leader, you can. My personal view is you can almost draft some of that. It's almost like saying my vision, or what I think is, broadly speaking, where we're going is this, and taking that to your team and engaging with your team around that to get their input and their contributions and essentially their buy-in into that. So my key bit of advice would be for line leaders to say, look, rather than just accepting the corporate statements, make that meaningful for you and your team. Work with your team to create that and have ownership for that. And from that, other things come, because if they have clarity of direction based upon those constructs, you don't have to have all the sort of tiny conversations about whether they're going in the right direction, whether they should do this, whether they should do that, because they understand, they know it's there, they know where they're going. So I think then they've got a greater degree of autonomy and need less hand holding. So as a one nugget wonder, that's what I'd advise as a starting point.
Well, I think that's a great one nugget wonder. I'm going to ask you for another one. Well, sort of, which is it's the same question that we ask another similar question that we ask all of our guests as a way of kind of bringing everything to a close, which is if you were to start your career over again, and this is kind of quite a common question, what's the best piece of advice you would give yourself if you were starting your career again?
Take your first step, even though you might not know where your end goal is. And it's going to be more than one, sorry. And
that's right.
Listen carefully. Don't assume, and probe by questioning to get a better understanding, and rely on your instincts as well as your brain.
I think those are pretty good bits of advice. And that's the idea, is that, we hope that other people can kind of take that advice themselves. Maybe they're earlier on in their career and take those little golden nuggets. I really like that phrase that I'll use a bit more. Listen, Christoph, that's been absolutely wonderful. I'm afraid we've run out of time, so I'm going to have to bring us to a close there. But I'd love to talk to you more. Particularly, I was really fascinated by everything we talked about with the AI, kind of the way that might be weaving its way into and how we live our lives, particularly within HR context. So that just remains me to thank Christoph Williams again for joining me today. And if you would like to connect with either of us on LinkedIn, our links will be in the description, along with links to Impact, and if you'd like to find out anything else about those. So thank you again for joining us today, and until the next time, take care.